Overrated doesn't always mean talentless. The truth is, every director on this list has made at least one respected or influential film. The problem is reputation inflation. Too many times, we have seen one great film shield, later career stagnation. This is why the question we hope to answer is whether the praise still matches the work. So, let's get into it. Number 1. Michael Bay. This is the easiest name on this list to dismiss, and that's exactly why he's worth starting with. Bay can direct. At his best, he understands momentum, geography, and tension better than many filmmakers who get far more critical protection. His 1996 film, The Rock, is proof. It's loud, sure, but it's also coherent. You always know where characters are, what they want, and what's at stake. Action scenes build instead of blur. You can see that Sean Connery and Nicolas Cage aren't just reacting to explosions. They're actually driving the story. Bay's camera also supports the narrative instead of overpowering it. Even his visual excess feels motivated. If Bay had stayed anywhere near this balance, his reputation would be very different. But he didn't, and that's the problem. He didn't evolve his craft. Instead, he doubled down. At the other end of his filmography sits Transformers: The Last Knight, a film so narratively incoherent it barely functions as a movie. Plot threads appear and vanish mid-scene. Characters exist only to shout exposition. Emotional beats are introduced and immediately drowned out by noise. The editing isn't energetic, it's exhausting. This isn't his chaotic style, it's just neglect. You realize that the story and collaborators no longer restrain Bay's worst instincts. And yet, the Transformers franchise remains his most celebrated work in popular culture. This is where Bay becomes overrated, not because the films are disliked, but because their success is mistaken for craft. The franchise's box office dominance turned repetition into authorship. Explosions and excess became his personality and identity. Instead of asking whether the films were improving, the conversation shifted to how big they were. That commercial insulation matters in Bay's decline. When every movie makes hundreds of millions, refinement stops being necessary. Characters become disposable because spectacle sells. Emotional clarity is treated as optional because the scale distracts. Bay's visual language, once a tool, became a replacement for storytelling itself. What's striking is how often Bay is still judged by The Rock. Even decades later, that early success continues to justify later indulgence. Audiences and studios alike reference his peak and success while ignoring how far the fundamentals slipped. It's not that Bay forgot how to make a good movie, it's that he was never required to try again. That's what Overrated looks like here. Not failure, but stagnation disguised as confidence. A director whose name promises impact even when the film stopped delivering meaning. And once that dynamic sets in, it's hard to tell where authorship ends and autopilot begins. And away from Bay's box office dominance, we see what happens when creative freedom goes completely unchecked. Number 2. Peter Jackson. The director of the Lord of the Rings trilogy has definitely earned his reputation, but that's also what makes his placement here uncomfortable but necessary. At his peak, Jackson didn't just direct well, he pulled off something that bordered on impossible. The Lord of the Rings trilogy remains one of the great logistical and emotional achievements in modern cinema. 3 massive films, shot largely at once with a clear visual grammar, consistent tone, and an emotional through line that never collapses under scale. Characters grow. Stakes escalate organically. The effects serve the story instead of swallowing it. For all its size, the trilogy is disciplined. Every excess is counterbalanced by restraint. Jackson knew when to linger and when to move on, but that success didn't just define his career, it also froze it. Almost everything that followed has been judged against that singular achievement and quietly excused for falling short. The clearest example is the Hobbit trilogy, a project whose existence relies almost entirely on Jackson's goodwill. The source material is slim, whimsical, and intimate. It never demanded 3 films. Yet Jackson's reputation transformed a modest story into an overextended epic, one padded with invented conflicts, recycled imagery, and digital spectacle that strained to feel consequential. And nowhere is that clearer than in The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies, a film that confuses length with importance. The stakes are artificially inflated. Action scenes feel weightless because they go on too long to sustain tension. CGI crowds replace spatial clarity. What should feel like a culmination instead feels like an obligation. This is where Jackson becomes overrated, not because he lacks talent, but because one monumental success granted him permanent immunity. His later indulgence is framed as ambition. His excesses are treated as vision. and any criticism is softened by reminders of past greatness, as if craft were transferable across decades without re-evaluation. There's a common defense that Jackson was pressured by studios. That's partly true, as he originally planned The Hobbit as 2 films, but pressure alone doesn't explain the loss of discipline. Plenty of directors face expansion without surrendering coherence. What changed here wasn't just scope, it was editorial judgment. And yet, Jackson's name still carries weight disproportionate to his recent output. Each new project arrives wrapped in legacy, not scrutiny. His best work continues to justify weaker decisions long after the context has changed. That's the pattern emerging. A director whose reputation solidified faster than his evolution, and whose past success now does the work his films no longer consistently do. And so from Jackson's frozen legacy, we discuss a director whose early success made his style untouchable. Number 3. Denis Villeneuve. The Canadian filmmaker is often spoken about with a kind of automatic reverence. His films are quiet, serious, and carefully composed, and because of that, they're frequently treated as profound by default. But restraint isn't the same thing as depth, and silence doesn't guarantee meaning. At his best, Villeneuve is precise and emotionally grounded. Arrival is the clearest example of that balance working perfectly. The high concept premise, language reshaping perception of time, never overwhelmed the human core. Science fiction exists to serve character, not impress the audience. Amy Adams's performance anchors the film emotionally, and Villeneuve knows exactly when to hold back and when to lean in. The result feels thoughtful without feeling distant. It's controlled, but never cold. That control is also why Arrival stands out so sharply from the rest of his work. Because the film most often held up as his masterpiece, Blade Runner 2049 is also where his limitations become impossible to ignore. Visually, it's stunning. Every frame is curated, textured, and deliberate, but narrative engagement takes a back seat to atmosphere. Scenes stretch without deepening character. Emotional beats are implied rather than earned. The film asks the audience to feel significance without always providing the connective tissue that makes it resonate. The admiration surrounding 2049 often focuses on how it looks, how patient it is, and how serious it feels. And that's exactly where the overrating begins. Slowness is interpreted as meaning. Ambiguity is treated as insight. But when stripped of its aesthetic power, the story struggles to justify its length or emotional distance. That's reflected in its performance. Despite critical adoration, the film underperformed commercially, suggesting a disconnect between prestige approval and audience connection. Villeneuve's weakest tendencies are most exposed in Enemy. Symbolism dominates the experience to the point of opacity. The film invites interpretation but withholds coherence. Instead of ambiguity opening doors, it closes them. What's meant to feel unsettling ends up feeling evasive. The viewer is left deciphering images rather than engaging with people. Although his recent series of works with Dune is changing the narratives of his career, we have to understand that that still doesn't put him in the discussions his fans do. A science fiction adaptation of a best-selling novel still doesn't put him in the GOAT tier. This is why I say Villeneuve is overrated. It's not because he lacks skill, but because seriousness is mistaken for substance. His films often prioritize concept over character and mood over momentum. Intellectual framing replaces emotional payoff. The audience is expected to meet the film halfway, but the film doesn't always return the effort. There's a version of Villeneuve that works best when emotion leads while ideas follow. Arrival proves that. But too often, his reputation is built on how his films feel rather than what they ultimately deliver. And once a director is labeled prestige, questioning that label becomes harder than it should be. But if that's bad, what do we say when a director's personality itself becomes the product? Number 4. Wes Anderson. The American filmmaker's early reputation wasn't built on quirk alone. It was built on emotional specificity. His style existed to frame vulnerability, not replace it. That balance is why The Royal Tenenbaums remains his most complete achievement. The film is meticulously designed, but the design sharpens the pain rather than insulating it. Each character carries real damage, and the symmetry, color, and deadpan humor function as coping mechanisms, not distractions. The stylization also doesn't soften the sadness, it makes it sting more. What made Tenenbaums work is that the emotional core came first, then the style followed. But that relationship reverses in the film, most often praised as his pinnacle, the Grand Budapest Hotel. It's frequently cited as Anderson at peak form, but that praise largely revolves around precision. The framing is immaculate. The timing is perfect. Every element is engineered to fit the aesthetic machine, but the emotional substance is thin. Characters are charming, but distant. Tragedy is referenced rather than experienced. The film moves quickly, cleverly, and beautifully, but rarely pauses long enough to let anything land. The result is admiration rather than attachment. The Grand Budapest Hotel is enjoyed as a construct, not absorbed as a story. Its reputation rests more on how efficiently it delivers Wes Anderson-ness than on what it ultimately says or feels. That's where overrating creeps in as craftsmanship is mistaken for resonance. This drift reaches its most extreme point in Asteroid City, Anderson's weakest work to date. The film is so self-aware, so layered in metastructure and theatrical framing that it actively resists emotional access. Characters exist to illustrate ideas about storytelling rather than to experience anything themselves. The audience is constantly reminded they're watching something constructed, which leaves no room for immersion. What once felt intimate now feels sealed behind glass. The reason Anderson is in my overrated category today isn't that he lacks talent, it's because his brand now does the work his storytelling used to do. Familiarity replaces risk. Characters flatten into design elements. Emotion is implied through music cues and composition instead of being earned through behavior and consequence. His films are increasingly discussed in terms of palettes, fonts, and framing ratios rather than arcs, choices, or growth. That shift is telling, as Anderson's visual language is now studied more intensely than his characters, a reversal of his early career priorities when the style existed to support emotional wounds rather than display control. The films are still pleasant, sometimes beautiful, but they're no longer vulnerable. And when a director's work becomes safer as it becomes more recognizable, reputation starts to outrun impact. But in my opinion, a director using aesthetics as a crutch is a lot better than one who confuses seriousness with significance. Number 5. Zack Snyder. The reputation of the creator of the so-called Snyderverse is built on the volume of imagery, scale, and seriousness he showcases. But at his best, he was never about excess. His strongest film, Dawn of the Dead, works precisely because it's restrained. The pacing is tight, the geography is clear, and the film understands its genre well enough to play within it. Characters are functional, but legible. Stakes are immediate. Style enhances momentum instead of smothering it. Snyder isn't trying to say something profound here, and that honesty is why it works. The problems begin when ambition outpaces comprehension. His most overrated film, Man of Steel, is treated as deep simply for being heavy. The film adopts a mythic tone, gods among men, destiny, sacrifice, but never interrogates those ideas. Destruction is framed as tragic grandeur rather than consequence. Moral confusion is presented as philosophical complexity. The movie insists it's asking big questions, yet it rarely slows down to explore any of them through character choice or emotional fallout. In this film, Superman never evolves, he endures, and endurance is not the same as development. That misunderstanding defines Snyder's career arc. His weakest film, Army of the Dead, exposes the issue without the shield of IP reverence. Here, the visual excess remains, but the structure collapses. Plot logic is inconsistent. Character motivations shift scene to scene. The film gestures at themes, grief, sacrifice, capitalism, without committing to any. What's left is aesthetic noise, slow motion applied where rhythm is needed, weight added where clarity would help. Why Snyder is overrated isn't because he lacks vision. It's because seriousness is consistently mistaken for insight. His films announce meaning instead of discovering it. Iconography replaces character psychology. Symbols are placed on screen and assumed to carry depth without being earned through narrative pressure. There's also an unresolved tension in his work. Violence is treated as both horrifying and operatic, destruction as both tragic and visually indulgent. That contradiction is rarely addressed, it's just beautified. The result is moral ambiguity framed as sophistication, when it often reads as uncertainty. An interesting pattern emerges when you look at form versus function. As Snyder's narratives weaken, his reliance on slow motion increases dramatically. What once emphasized impact now compensates for missing emotional beats. It's not accidental, it's structural. The films are trying to feel monumental even when the story can't support that weight. The open question, and the reason Snyder remains polarizing, is whether he's misunderstood or simply misaligned with his material. His most effective work happens when constraints are imposed. When left unchecked, the style overwhelms the story. And yet, his reputation continues to be judged on intent rather than execution, on how much he means rather than how well he communicates. That gap between ambition and understanding is where Overrated lives. And so we move on from a director with a fixation on myth to a director whose early magic hardened into habit. Number 6. Tim Burton. This is a director whose reputation rests on a feeling of alienation rendered whimsical, loneliness stylized into a gothic fairy tale. At his best, that feeling was sincere. Edward Scissorhands remains the clearest expression of Burton as an artist rather than a brand. The film is personal without being indulgent and strange without trying to impress. Its outsider isn't special because the world misunderstands him. He's vulnerable because he doesn't belong anywhere. The suburban setting isn't just an aesthetic contrast, it's thematic pressure. Burton isn't hiding behind style here. The emotion is simple, direct, and earned. It is also that same sincerity that makes the rest of his career so frustrating. Alice in Wonderland is Burton's most overrated work, not because it's uniquely terrible, but because it's treated as proof of his continued relevance. The film reduces his once handcrafted weirdness into an industrial CGI spectacle. Color replaces texture. Quirk replaces character. The story flattens into a generic hero's journey that feels actively hostile to Burton's earlier sensitivity toward misfits and ambiguity. It made over $1 billion, and that commercial validation insulated him from meaningful criticism. From that point forward, Burton-esque became a visual preset rather than an emotional perspective. The hollowing out becomes undeniable with Dumbo, 2019, his weakest film. This should have been personal, an outsider story about exploitation and spectacle, but it plays like an obligation. The imagery is familiar, the themes are gestured at, and the heart feels absent. Even Burton later described feeling like the elephant in the circus, trapped inside a corporate machine. That self-awareness is telling, but it comes after the damage is done. Recognizing detachment isn't the same as correcting it. Why Burton is overrated today isn't about his early work failing to matter. It's about how long that early work has been used as cover. His gothic aesthetic is routinely mistaken for imagination, even when the ideas underneath have stalled. The reliance on familiar collaborators like Johnny Depp, Helena Bonham Carter, and Danny Elfman once created a sense of communal creativity. Over time, it devolved into repetition. What once felt like a troupe began to feel like a safety net. The most troubling shift is how Burton's outsider identity became commodified. His films insist on marginality while being fully embedded in the safest corners of mainstream cinema. Everyone is an outcast, but only within tightly controlled, marketable parameters. The sincerity that once animated his work has been replaced by autopilot, style executing itself without interrogation. The open question is whether Burton can rediscover curiosity now that his outsider status is no longer performative but real again, or whether the Burton-esque has become too comfortable to risk dismantling. And from a legend coasting on yesterday's alienation, we move to a filmmaker who was crowned a visionary before his voice had time. Number 7. Jordan Peele. One thing we can all agree on is that Jordan Peele's rise was meteoric, but that speed matters when discussing why he's already drifting into overrated territory. Get Out is legitimately excellent, precise, disciplined, and sharply observed. Its brilliance lies not just in its social commentary, but in how cleanly that commentary is embedded in genre mechanics. The horror works even if you strip the metaphor away. Character decisions feel motivated, tension escalates logically, and the film knows exactly when to stop explaining itself. It's lean, controlled, and confident without being smug. That debut success, however, hardened Peele's reputation almost instantly. By the time Us arrived, expectation had begun to outpace execution. The film is ambitious and often striking, but it mistakes density for depth. Its central concept is rich in suggestion but collapses under scrutiny, requiring exposition that actively undermines its mystique. Symbolism multiplies faster than meaning, and the film seems unsure whether it wants to be an allegory, a home invasion thriller, or a mythic parable. It's not that Us lacks ideas, it has too many and not enough discipline to unify them. Nope, Peele's weakest film so far continues that drift. The premise is clever and individual sequences are effective, but the movie feels like several half-films stitched together. Western revisionism, spectacle critique, creature feature, and Hollywood satire, all competing for attention. The result is a film that's interesting scene to scene but oddly distant as a whole. Emotional through lines are implied rather than developed, and thematic ambition once again outruns narrative focus. Why Peele is increasingly overrated isn't because he lacks intelligence or vision. It's because symbolism is often treated as substance and ambiguity is used as insulation from critique rather than as a tool for resonance. Serious themes are explained aloud instead of being embodied through character behavior. There's a growing sense that Peele trusts the weight of his ideas more than the audience's ability to feel them organically. Another factor is timing. Peele's reputation solidified too early. One near perfect debut positioned him as a generational voice before his limitations had time to surface. Every subsequent film is now framed as a statement, even when the craft doesn't fully support that framing. Criticism often feels muted, as if questioning execution risks questioning intent. Notably, Peele has increasingly shifted toward producing rather than directing. That move can be read as expansion, but it may also suggest a recognition that his strengths lie in concept generation and curation more than sustained directorial control. The question is whether Peele will recalibrate, strip back, refocus, and let the story do the work again, or whether expectation will continue to write checks his films struggle to cash. I doubt this will be the last time we see Peele as a director. These careers mostly follow the same arc. Early success turns into myth. Myth becomes insulation. As a director's name hardens into a brand, the films stop needing to prove themselves. Criticism dulls. Weaknesses get reframed as ambition, and familiarity replaces evaluation. None of these filmmakers lack talent. Each earned their reputation at some point. The question is how long that reputation has been allowed to stand in for growth and self-interrogation. So now it's your turn. Which director here still gets a free pass? Which reputation feels most disconnected from the actual films?
Drop your picks in the comments. And if you like breakdowns like this, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. One question before you go. Which directors not mentioned here do you think are overrated?